Welcome, digital minions, relations, hangers-ons, friends, co-workers, and general ne'er-do-wells. I'm Daniel, and this is Driving and Dragons, the YouTube show where we cover anything and everything TTRPG related from a more analytical perspective while wrenching on old cars and driving about the roads of central Alabama. Today's video is on a topic everyone has covered before, including myself, but it's come up again in the discussion, and my older video is one that I have to reshoot anyway, and I've needed to for a long time, because it was one of my first videos, and audio was horrible, so here we are, taking another stab at it so I can quietly sweep that video under the rug. The topic, railroads and sandboxes. These are two of the most misused terms in the TTRPG world, and to my mind, they are largely misunderstood because the people throwing these terms about have not bothered to stop and consider the very real and objective definitions for terms while also mislabeling them as something that they are not. For instance, a railroad is not a narrative or design style. It's an application of game mechanics. First, let's examine the illustrative qualities of the two objects that we've chosen to represent these gaming concepts, a sandbox and a railroad. Sandbox is a box filled with sand, where the user is given tools to freely shape the sand into whatever they wish. So far, so good. But where the players of the TTRPGs seem to go astray is that there are limits. The sandbox has boundaries, otherwise it wouldn't be a box. Sand has limitations on what it can do and how it can be used. Not every tool will be available to shape the sand. After all, unless the player is given access to a furnace capable of sustaining 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, the sand cannot be melted to make glass. Once the sand starts being shaped, the options of what to do next also become more and more restricted and more linear. If I move sand from one side of the box to the other to build a bigger sand castle, I lose the ability to build a sand castle on the side that I took the sand from. A railroad, on the other hand, is a fixed path made of beams and planks connecting 2 points. The cars that travel on the rails are fixed to the rails and have no ability to turn from the path. They can go forward, they can go backwards, they can stop, they can change speeds. This is the limit of the options afforded the rail car itself. This is not the same as a road where stepping off the path is an option regardless of the difficulty of that option. Fixed points along a linear path from which no deviation is permitted. That is what characterizes a railroad. I want you to remember those images because one way you can quickly assess if something is or isn't a sandbox or a railroad is by applying those visuals in comparison to the situation that you're considering. Now for my definitions of sandbox and railroad as they apply to tabletop role-playing games. Spoiler alert, in my experience, there are virtually no tables that are playing either of these styles. I guess I would call most of the games I've seen being discussed something in the middle, maybe Lego blocks games or guided tours. So a sandbox. Sandboxing is a gameplay style where numerous options for narrative progression are available and independent of one another, and progression along one path is determined largely by the resolution of decisions made along the chosen path or paths. Railroad. Railroading is the artificial, arbitrary, and irrational restriction of player agency regarding the consequences of their in-game decisions, designed to force narrative progression along a single predetermined course. Right up front, you can see the biggest problem with a railroad versus sandbox debate is they're not mutually exclusive, nor are they mutually inclusive. A sandbox is exclusively a big picture concept. It loses its meaning when applied to individual scenarios. Sandbox is both a style of gameplay and a philosophy of adventure and campaign design. Meanwhile, railroading is a mechanical application of the narrative to influence the situation. These are apples and oranges. To put it simply, A sandbox can easily be filled with railroads. Let's explore an example that was discussed on the Elven Made In Discord server. Caveat first, you have to be careful not to commit the gravest sin regarding discourse and debate of any topic, a sin which is by far the most common both on and offline, and that is challenging a premise by altering or attacking the example as opposed to the point. For example, if you get presented with, you're in a desert with no water and the only water source is a brackish pool, it does you no good, nor does it in any way prove your point or disprove the point made by coming in with something like, why is it that that's the only water source? Why would I ever be in the desert without my water skin? I would never do that. I wouldn't, so this is a stupid example. Or, I'd just use these 5 other items that you didn't explicitly mention I don't have to get water. This is essentially a way to avoid having to address the point that is made by shifting the argument to a quest for a perfect example. Accept the premise, given as it is, and focus on the actual topic. With that out of the way, say the characters are in prison. The only way to escape is to get past a guard. This is a good example of not attacking the example. Don't argue about why can't they do this? Why can't they do that? Assume that these avenues were already explored and deemed not possible solutions. So the only possible way is to go past the guard. You can't dig out. There's no way to knock down the wall. You can't climb a wall. All of this stuff is already addressed somehow. The players need to get out to continue the adventure. And dealing with the guard, by hook or by crook, is the only way out. The simple fact that the only way out is getting past the guard is not a railroad. Why not? Because there are no arbitrary or irrational restrictions on this situation as of yet. The other ways out of the situation have logical and rational reasons that they are not an avenue to solve the problem. Even if the guard is ultra loyal and some kind of mindless golem that can't be bribed, threatened, or persuaded, it's not in and of itself a railroad. This is simply a situation where the players have been boxed into a corner. This could even be in a sandbox game where the decisions and actions of the players themselves effectively used all the sand to build this sandcastle, and now they're left with only dismantling the castle as an option for further play in the sand. Where it becomes railroading is if the scenario is artificially or irrationally restricted to preserve a particular narrative progression. For instance, the players can jump and beat the guard for his keys, but they can't kill him no matter what because, he has some role to play in the future. If the players have the ability and the opportunity, it has to be allowed, and the GM has to adjust to the guard now being dead. Perhaps they want to steal his keys. The GM feels that that he has covered every possible idea that the players could come up with for this, but because that isn't how he wants them to solve that particular issue. He's thought about this. I got to find a way to make sure they don't steal the keys. But then the players come up with a perfectly rational idea that the GM didn't think of. Even if it's a long shot, the attempt should be allowed. I would even say that the parameters for success, such as what needs to be rolled and what skills used, should be revealed up front so everyone knows that a failure was a result of a fair and honest attempt. Railroading happens when the GM says to himself, damn, I didn't think of that. Then tells the players they can't do it, makes them fail automatically, or changes the parameters of the scenario on the fly to make that idea no longer plausible. For example, the guard has always consistently made 30-minute rounds, but suddenly he comes back 15 minutes early to conveniently catch the players in their preparations for this unforeseen solution, thus making it to where it's no longer something that they can do. Railroading is not having players on a linear path. If they can turn off the road, it's just a path, not a railroad. Even in a sandbox, there are going to be empty areas where nothing of interest is in existence. and the decisions to go there instead of over to the pile of toys is not a railroad. It's simply consequences of those decisions. I chose this morning to get up and go to work. It would have been way more exciting for me to rob a bank and go on a high-speed chase. The good Lord even put 2 banks on the way to my office. I was not being railroaded because my decision to go to work instead of knocking over a credit union ended up to be more boring. At the end of the day, railroad is a lot like racism. It has an actual meaning, and it's a very bad thing. But it is also a word that people with a dishonest set of intentions throw around in situations where it does not apply to try and bully other people into compliance. I didn't get my way, or you didn't give me agency over the results of my character's actions is not a railroad. To finish up, let's discuss the anatomy of a sandbox as a method of adventure or campaign design, as well as a few of their lesser mentioned but far more common cousins. We'll cover them in descending order from most open to most linear. I've decided to refer to these narrative play / design styles as sandbox, Lego blocks, living world, guided tour, and linear narrative. First, the sandbox. The true sandbox is very well represented by its namesake. The box has hard boundaries around a largely formless medium. The game master fills the box with features and tools, and the players decide where they want to go, what they want to explore, and this can even be taken to its ultimate extreme as a hex crawl that has a random table for every hex. As the players make decisions to set in motion by those decisions, branch off into their own little sandboxes. That's what happens with the events. You decide to build a sandcastle, you have now changed the possible choices for that area of the sandbox. In a true sandbox, if you select one adventure path, story hook, etc., the only thing really impacted by that choice is that specific aspect of the game world. If it's truly random, what happened in this hex has no bearing on what happens when you move to the next and roll its context. However, the world does become more restricted because each decision takes one formless nothing and turns it into a concrete and established reality. Eventually, your map will be full and there will be no more blank tiles. In a sandbox that is more planned out by the game master, using one tool has no impact on the others. For instance, going to mine A instead of castle B provided a different adventure. But what you do in Mine A changes nothing about what awaits you in Castle B, save to potentially change the resources that the players will take with them to Castle B. Next is what I'll call Lego Blocks game. This is my term, feel free to steal it. As of this recording, I've never heard it before. But a Lego Blocks is what most of us think of as a sandbox. This is where the setting is interconnected like a real functioning world, but it still operates a lot like a sandbox. Imagine you have a bunch of Lego blocks. You still have a tremendous amount of options when you start putting things together, but each decision puts restrictions on what the players can do next as they add, remove, shift, and change the pieces to form a complete project. It is more restrictive than the sandbox, more defined. If you start with Mine A in the Lego blocks, it changes how you can interact with Castle B, and how you choose to put those two pieces together changes how you can incorporate Island C or Mountain D or Temple E. This is a more natural world where your actions in one place directly influence what happens in another. In all of the non-linear design styles, the threat of railroading is largely behind the game master screen, with things like the Quantum Ogre, where the played adventure happens in the next square, regardless of what square the players pick or what random table gets rolled on, as well as on the small scale, such as in that prison example, where the actual encounter itself is altered by the game master in an arbitrary way to prevent certain results. Now let's move on to a living world. This is the dead center of the narrative playstyle axis. In the living world, everything moves along with the players. If they go to mine A, the events that are unfolding in Castle B result in missed opportunities and changed circumstances. Perhaps Castle B is just a ruin because while the players were exploring the mines, the Black Priest from Temple E attacked the castle, razed it to the ground, and hauled the inhabitants off as slaves. This is the beginning of a war where island peoples over on Island C close off their ports, and the guerrilla resistance movement hides in the mountains to harass the people from the temple. These events move forward regardless of what the player's actions are, which only affect the part of the world that they happen to be in at the time. This is overall the most realistic method of design. This is where players are put into a world that behaves as the real world does, where they can be swept up in events beyond their control and become the stuff of legends, or they can spend their efforts trying to carve out their own path while history happens around them. It also happens to be the most prep work, both up front and between sessions, on the Game Master. Moving into the realm of linear stories, we find the guided tour. This is a less labor-intensive, more structured version of the living world, and it's also where unintentional railroading becomes a concern for a GM that they have to make note of while they're running the game. The guided tour is where players are put into a world with a predetermined series of events to explore, and the action of the adventure relies on following those events. Sure, a player can choose to ignore the sheriff pleading for help with the orc bandits, but they will go hang out in the tavern and do nothing while not learning that the bandits were actually just scouts for, a great orc army, and they'll find themselves fighting desperately to defend the town from the orc warband. Had they gone on the mission to stop the bandits, they would have known the orc warband was on the way. Then they could rush back to help the town prepare while a messenger goes to get help from the closest garrison. Or they could just steer clear. The point is, the orcs are still coming to attack the town regardless, and the GM has provided the signs to point the party to the adventure that is part of that story. Which of the several routes they choose to take and how they get there is up to them, but that is what will be happening in the world around them. The threat of railroading comes on the large scale when the players push back against the obvious adventure hooks. While there is a strong case that deliberately avoiding plot hooks and adventure triggers for no reason other than they are recognized as hooks is a violation of the social contract and is a form of bad faith play, a game master is still not justified in trying to engineer things to drag the players back to the guided doors path. The last and most linear of the design styles is linear narrative. This is when the events of the campaign or adventure are predetermined and just sit kind of suspended in time until addressed by the players. A classic example of this is most adventure modules when taken at face value as written. The Tomb of Horrors is a straight line path from Hillside to Demi-Lich, or more likely from Hillside to Unceremonious Demise, but it is not a railroad. The players still choose how to approach the traps, puzzles, and tricks. They still choose what room to go in next, how to fight enemies, how to use resources, and what to do next. But that set of rooms is all there is, and no matter what you do in room 1, room 2 still sits waiting for the players to enter it, unconcerned with what happens before and after. In the above example, the orc warband simply sits in their territory until the players address the bandit scouts. While not inherently a railroad, this is the design style that most often leads to active railroading. Even professional modules have examples of this, the most famous being the truly awful Dragons of Flame, the second Dragonlance module from TSR in 1984. That module essentially made the players passive observers, as NPCs were invincible until they were supposed to die, at which point they could not be saved. The party was forcibly captured and put in a prison wagon that is scripted to be completely inescapable until the elves rescue the players, and the villain is unable to be defeated regardless of how the dice fall. Having only one way to advance the adventure is not a railroad. Consistently being made to satisfy that one way to advance the adventure in a specific manner is particularly if it's required that a certain logical consequences and possible actions are deemed impossible for no reason. So that's it. That's the Reader's Digest version of Sandbox and Railroading. Why people talk past each other and so much when they're discussing it, and how you should consider things before throwing those terms around. Plus, you get the parabolograph of prep and linearity thrown in there for good measure. For now, let me know your thoughts on railroading, sandboxing, and the definitions and ideas put forth here in the comments below. And while you're at it, like, share, and subscribe, and just share this link in every GM social media group you know of. See you Monday for Intelligence is a Dumpstat.